Taino history. In Spain, the monarchs were building a system of control to govern the colonies in America. This included Boriquén, present-day Puerto Rico. Among the measures they implemented was the creation of a caste system. The Spaniards had forced the Taínos to be baptized and to change their names to Spanish ones. This opened the possibility that a Taíno or their descendants could rise to power and seek Puerto Rico's independence or justice for the wrongs they had suffered. To prevent this and keep power in the hands of Spaniards, a caste system was created to ensure the exclusion of millions of converted indigenous people. Within this framework, the laws of Burgos of 1512 and the new laws of 1542 reinforced the notion that the Spaniard held a superior status and that he was protected by the crown above indigenous people, enslaved Africans, or any mix of them. With that idea, the caste system was created. At the top were the Peninsulares, who were called whites, but not all were white. They were just the Spaniards born in Spain. They held the highest positions in government, the church, and commerce. They were called whites, even though they really were not all Caucasian. They were people from mixed races. Some had olive skin, while others had dark skin. Spain had always coexisted and traded with peoples from Africa and the Middle East. Africa is only 8 miles from Spain, and you can physically see the African coast from Spain's shoreline with the naked eye. The African Berbers conquered and lived in Spain for 781 years, from the year 711 until 1492, the very same year Columbus set sail for the Americas. How then can we claim that the Spaniards were purely Caucasians and white, when their history shows they were always intertwined with Africans and Muslims? It's a historical inaccuracy. In reality, they are not. Their culture absorbed Muslim, Arab, Jewish, and African influences for centuries. When Columbus discovered America, Spain expelled these peoples not only for religious reasons, but also to concentrate the wealth and gold that were found, and to prevent those communities from benefiting from them. But this did not erase 781 years of genetic mixing. It is not a personal opinion to say that Spain was seen as the dark relative of Europe. That is how historians and travelers of the time described it. The British, in the height of the Victorian era, popularized the view of Spain as an exotic, violent, and backward place. In newspapers and chronicles, they compared Andalusia to African territories. Philosophers like Hegel went so far as to describe it as a half-African place because of its Muslim past. 19th century French intellectuals portrayed it as a Middle Eastern country within Europe. The writer Théophile Gautier summed up that stigma by stating that Africa begins at the Pyrenees. The countries that most spread this view of Spain as the dark relative of Europe were France, England, and Germany in the 19th century. Some history books in the Americas still mistakenly portray the Spaniard as white, Caucasian, blonde, and blue-eyed. But the reality is far more complex. The Spaniard was not truly a white Caucasian person. They were called white to prevent the Native Americans to rule their own lands. Spaniards born in the Americas were called criollos. This gave them a certain legal power and recognition of whiteness, but at the same time marked them as not belonging to Spain, keeping them one step below the Spanish who born in the peninsula. If a Spaniard committed an assault against a Taíno woman and a child was born from that assault, that child was called a mestizo. But many baptized Taínos were also classified in historical documents as mestizos when they were given a Spanish name. That is the reason why, in the early years of the colony, thousands of Taíno adults were already recorded as mestizos. This makes no biological or chronological sense. How could there be adult mestizos just 5 or 10 years after colonization, if not enough time had passed for children of unions between Spaniards and Taínos to be born, let alone to reach adulthood? The explanation is that those adult mestizos were not really the children of recent unions, but Taínos reclassified by the colonial system. Through forced baptism and the imposition of Spanish names, they were stripped of their indigenous identity and labeled as mestizos. In this way, the crown turned them into a fictitious intermediate class that could be used as agricultural laborers, artisans, or soldiers, while officially erasing the existence of the Taínos as the original people and rightful owners of the land of Puerto Rico. Then the mix of indigenous and African, or the Spaniard and African, was called Zambo. The Spaniards used this term in a derogatory way, applying it to the children of indigenous and Africans and the Spaniard and African to mark them as an inferior group. Zambo meant that the person had crooked legs, but this was not the physical reality of these people. The constitution of the indigenous and the African was very strong, but they were described this way to discriminate against them and place them in a caste lower than the mestizos, because the Spaniards did not consider Africans to be human beings. The Zambos had no physical defects. They were recognized by the copper-colored skin of the Taínos and the curly hair of the Africans. The other caste was that of the surviving indigenous people. At first, they were considered vassals of the crown under the laws of the Indies, but in practice, they were enslaved in the encomiendas. Later, once baptized and renamed, they were erased from official records and reclassified as Zambos or mestizos to give the impression that they had disappeared. Lastly, there were the enslaved Africans. They were the most abused. They were not considered people at all. To the Spaniards, they were objects, but in reality, they were the economic lungs of the island, the labor foundation of production and commerce. They were brought mainly to work in sugarcane, coffee, and livestock. Some managed to escape or buy their freedom, and they were called cimarrones or libertos. But the Spanish system maintained both indigenous and African slavery as the foundation of the colonial economy. If a mestizo person rose to a high position in society, they had to go through the whitening of castes, which was a very difficult process to achieve. This process required Spanish families classified as peninsulares or criollos to write to the king, certifying that for generations your family had faithfully served the crown. You had to convince the bishop of the island to recommend you, and he had to approve the process by sending a letter directly to the king. You had to demonstrate wealth, political influence, and social connections. Then came a wait of years and the payment of large sums of money before the crown decided whether or not to grant the change. The only documented example in Puerto Rico of a change of caste was that of Ramón Emeterio Betances' father, Felipe Betances Ponce. He completed the process and obtained legal recognition of whiteness. But the case was surrounded by mystery. Just as the documents from Felipe Betances' family arrived from Spain, certifying the change from mulatto to white, Felipe was mysteriously eliminated. No one knows what he died of or how. What is known is that his son Ramón Emeterio Betances, who was at the university in France, was not allowed to return to Puerto Rico during his father's death. The family's sugar mill, profitable for decades, quickly fell into ruin under suspicious circumstances at the hands of a bankrupt German banker named Guillermo Schröder. Follow us to learn more about your history, because the Taínos are still here preserving our history.